remember, Aristotle said there are three kinds of credibility. Are you a good person? Are you passionate enough to follow through with what you say? And do you know what you're talking about? And the legacy media is only ever focused on that third one. And they're missing 2/3 of what most humans really think about.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley in Context, and I'm glad to have my friend back. Dr. Jeff Myers was on our program about 6 months ago. He's the president of Summit Ministries, and I want to encourage parents and grandparents, you need to check out the ministry opportunities at Summit. This is an extraordinary camp, conference, spiritual enrichment. One of the programs is called Unbound, and we'll have all that information in the show notes. But your introduction to Jeff, if it's just today, you're going to be glad you tuned in to watch and or listen. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Jeff's background and vita because we have that in the show notes. He's been on the program before. But prior to the election last year, I interviewed about 6 subject matter experts and said, how do we approach this election? Because not only is our country divided, but Christians are very divided and combative and having a hard time with the Harris-Trump election cycle. And of all the guests, they were all super helpful, but Jeff ministered to me. And 3 things he said in our interview were, it's not the lesser of 2 evils. It's think about lessening evil. And that was a game changer for me mentally. That's a great way to talk about it. Secondly, was keeping the leash tight, and we might come back to that. And third was focus on local issues as well as national. And this, I think, is probably a scary area for people to get involved in political things locally. It can be very challenging. So anyway, I appreciated Jeff's wisdom and insight. And so now that we're post-election, now that we're about 30-some days when we're recording this today, thanks, Jeff, for coming back to chat with me.
Michael, I'm glad to be with you. I hope we don't generate too much hate mail from this. But kudos to you, because some of these issues are so tough that some people just want to avoid them, and you press ahead. And I fully recognize that people who are listening, we might not agree on all these things, and I'm not going to shove anything down your throat, but I'll try to clearly articulate how I see things and why I see them that way. Because you're right, man. There's a whole lot more heat than light being generated out there right now.
Interestingly, of course, the day we record this will be different when it's released, but a friend of mine is in Florida, and he just texted me moments before we connected that this, of course, is the first day of Trump's cabinet meeting, his first cabinet meeting. And I don't know if you saw or heard this, but evidently he opened in prayer, and he actually concluded his prayer in Jesus' name.
Wow.
So wow. I don't know any more than that. I'm sure those who want to embrace that are going to be excited, and those who want to attack it are going to be, the same. So anyway, so let me get your sense of kind of the pulse from your spheres of influence. How are people reacting? What are you seeing, hearing responses?
Well, it seems to be 2 different responses. One is a sense of relief that we're in a place. So for our organization, we're often under attack on religious liberty issues. 3 different times in my tenure as president of Summit Ministries, we've had to go to the mat in a legal perspective to defend our right to conscience as an organization. So there are a lot of people who feel a sense of relief. It's not that they are on board with everything Donald Trump does or says. It's just they feel like we were constantly under attack for the last 4 years, always having to look out for different administrative orders that were coming down and having to protect ourselves legally. And now we've got somebody in the White House who's not going to attack us legally. That's one perspective. The other perspective on this, and obviously I know there are people out there who say Trump is Hitler and blah, blah, blah. It's usually the amateur historians who went to one lecture on World War II, and now they're thoroughgoing experts on this, and they know all the memes. But most people I know that's not the conversation they're having right now. The conversation they're having is, how do you stay faithful to a biblical worldview when it might call you to stand against a guy who you might have supported or who you generally think is going in the right direction? How do you stand as a wise counselor when rather than just saying, I totally agree with 100% of everything that happens in this administration?
One of the observations I've had, and again, the spheres of influence, we have to be careful, but there seems to be a relief, and some of it would pertain to, the so-called weaponization of, DOJ, for example, against, a woman who prays at a abortion clinic, or a husband who led a prayer vigil. I mean, just some interesting things. And the other seems to be sort of a, there was so much of the DEI and the trans issues, and it wasn't just don't ask, don't tell. It was in your face. It wasn't even you had to be supportive of it. You had to celebrate it. Right. You have to celebrate it, and you have to vilify a cisgendered person like me, or a heterosexual monogamous marriage like Cindy and me. And I think that was a bridge too far for just a lot of America, even without the falderall of the candidates. It just felt like this is so ominous. And now all of a sudden, DEI is going away. These corporations, Robbie Starbuck is single-handedly changing corporate America, and it's just interesting. And I hate to say it, but it's refreshing that, the public square can have an argument. And the election is what it is. And then there's people, as you said, differentiating left and right. But mainstream media, get your take on this, because you're far more connected to these things than I am. Mainstream media seems to be such a dwindling audience, yet it's still there. It's still as much, a left entity, right or wrong, no pun intended. What's your take on that? Because your audience is YouTube, TikTok. They're not watching TV at all, are they?
No. Well, several years ago, I'll just tell you a story, because I have two sons, one who's 28, one who's 21. My 28-year-old son said, do you ever listen, you should listen to this Joe Rogan podcast. And I think that he was interviewing the former lead singer from Van Halen or something. And I said, how long is the podcast? He said, it's about 3 hours. I said, are you serious? If it's more than 8 minutes long, I just don't think I'm going to listen.
We're done.
And he said, and you tell me that my generation only has an 8-second attention span. Now, the long form podcast medium is huge, especially with the young men who I work with at Summit Ministries. They have no problem listening to a 3-hour podcast. I did listen to the 3 hours that Joe Rogan did with Donald Trump and the 3 hours he did with J.D. Vance, both. I happened to be in a place where I was on long driving trips, and so I could do that. But this rising generation they've never seen CNN. The only time they've ever seen Fox News is when their grandparents have it on at their house.
True.
And MSNBC is just, the only people they know who watch MSNBC are their leftist, teachers from high school who are a little bit odd anyway. And so, they take it in perspective. Yeah, I like the teacher, but she's really weird and she's obsessed. And so, we just take everything she says with a grain of salt. I'm just trying to be honest with how my students see things. So when you realize that the entire landscape shifted, that it was podcasts like Joe Rogan, and there are quite a few others that are large as well, you realize that people are not going to what we call the mainstream media, or now what's being called the legacy media, for people to get their information. And there's good reason for that. The problem with the legacy media is that it doesn't allow a full discussion. There's never been a television program that's 3 hours unedited. That's never happened before. It's always sound bites. It's always edited. It's always looking for the gotcha moment, always trying to find the tension that creates the story. That's what they teach you in journalism class. So that people will stay tuned in for that 7-minute segment, so that they will watch the 3-minute commercial segment and they can make money. So the decline of the legacy media, by and large, as far as the rising generation is concerned, is totally unnoticeable. They never paid attention to it to begin with. For the discussion in America, the fact that people are able to get their views out there more widely is important. And the last thing I'll say on this, I was with a group of people at a church. They're older, they're senior adults. They have a class called Equipped for the Times, wonderful class in Texas. And I said, now, if you haven't heard the Joe Rogan show, you might want to check it out because this is really where the discussion is going with the rising generation. I said, now, you're going to have to, his language is rough.
Rough, yeah.
and some people some ladies came up to me afterward and they said, we just want you to know, we listen to Joe Rogan. But they get it. They get it. Why? Because they have grandkids and they understand that what happens on a 3-hour show is you take the measure of a person. Are they a good person? Are they the kind of person you can talk about? Can they only talk about the thing they're obsessed with, like politics, or can they talk about sports too? Can they talk about things that you're interested in? All of those things. Remember, Aristotle said there are 3 kinds of credibility. Are you a good person? Are you passionate enough to follow through with what you say? And do you know what you're talking about? And the legacy media is only ever focused on that third one. And they're missing 2/3 of what most humans really think about.
Interesting. When you interact with these, and we're talking 18 to, is it 35 is kind of the...
Yeah. So when you see Gen Z in a poll, it's the 18 to 24-year-olds. Gen Z goes down to, say, age 12, but you don't poll 12 to 18-year-olds. So when they say young adult voters, they're usually saying 18 to 24 or sometimes 18 to 26.
But Summit, you have a little broader bandwidth at Summit, correct?
Right. Yes. We work in our in-person programs, the ones in Manitou Springs, Colorado, Lookout Mountain, Georgia. We work with 16 to 22-year-olds primarily. So those who are on their way to a college or trade school or those who are already in that situation.
So when you sample those kids from all over the country, obviously there's some affinity that they would come to Summit. This isn't like sending a kid to a gap year who's not ready for college or, it's got some challenges perhaps. This is a kid that wants to learn, that has enough of a sampling, if you will, of Summit to know what they're getting. But they're all walks of life, right? They're left and right and independent and libertarians.
They're all over the map. The only requirement we have of students who come to Summit Ministries is that they like to learn. If you're a curious person and you like to learn, then we want you here. We want you to bring all of your tough questions with you. It serves the same purpose for students today as Francis Schaeffer's L'Abri program back in the late 60s and the 1970s, where if you're not sure what's going on or you just really want a boost in your sense of direction in life, you can come hang out with all kinds of other young people who are going to be the future leaders and who really do, most of them, want to love Jesus. But yes, you're right. Politically, they're coming from all over the map. So we speak to them about the core issues. Our speakers will say, I'm making a case for you. I recognize that people might disagree. After we're done, we're going to have a question and answer session for an hour. And you can hit me with any question you want.
Yeah.
That openness, it makes for some pretty, I'll say vibrant. I'll use the word vibrant discussion.
Well, but that's this generation too. If there's not sort of a collegial sparring or debate, you're not. It's back to whether you like him or not. Charlie Kirk, who can sit in front of kids yelling at him, and he's pretty good at blocking and bridging. And I think, well, you tell me. It seems like the younger mindset, it's sort of like they respect you more.
Absolutely, it builds tremendous respect. And I'm noticing the biggest effect, Michael, on that among the young men. So this is a sociological shift. Never before in recorded history have we been in a situation where young men are more interested in spiritual things than young women. But that is what I'm seeing happen, that the young men are very engaged. They're passionate, trying to understand what's going on. They are more engaged with church. They're more likely to consider themselves evangelicals. They're more likely to take a pro-life stance. They're more likely to be conservatives politically because they tie that together with their faith. They see some of the things we talked about when we were together 6 months ago. They see all of that. Now, this is an emerging trend. It's not something that's full blown or like every young man is moving in this direction, but it's absolutely happening.
Do you think part of that is because we've vilified men for so long and pushed them down and feminized them? And Podol's, you'll know the name, the feminization of the church. I mean, there was so much anti-male, and maybe some was warranted from the chauvinistic, attitudes of the past. But is it sort of an overcompensation? Now, wait a minute. You can't completely take my testosterone out of me. I like to hit a ball. I like to run. I like to have a fight with my neighborhood kid and shake hands when that was part of growing up for us. And today that's repressed and suppressed and vilified.
Man, I'm actually working on a book on this very topic right now, and I'm co-authoring it with Dr. Kathy Cook. It's called Gender Confident Kids. And the idea is we want boys to be boys and girls to be girls. That we're biologically, as well as spiritually, psychologically hardwired with a gender of either male or female. And so when a church becomes more gender neutral, sort of like having gender neutral dolls, the girls play with them like they were regular dolls. The boys use them as swords. They don't play in the same way. They never have. And we've observed this with children as young as 9 months of age. So it's not like we're being socialized to prefer one or the other. But but yes, so many young men used to say to me, I just don't find a place in church. I just don't think they want men there really. All the songs they sing are very emotional. They're almost like love songs to Jesus, which is kind of creepy. This is what they tell me. The sermon doesn't really challenge me that hard. It's kind of a soft sell. Young men they gravitate especially toward older men who will say, look, you might not agree with me, but this is the way I see it. And they just flat out lay out their case. And the young men say, okay, I get that. I know I can argue with you. I know you're not going to force anything on me, but I feel safe here to think and to be what I can't not be.
Let's go back to some post-election specificity. Those who, let's say, were ensconced on the left, and we talk about Trump derangement syndrome, for example. Do you think there's a shift culturally that some of these folks are kind of? It's sort of like some of the. We didn't necessarily want to vote for Trump, but we couldn't vote the other way. And again, I loved your comment about who is more likely to lessen evil, and where's law and order in a culture. But with this obvious swing of some voters who either were silent or cautious, didn't want to be identified with Trump, who ostensibly did vote for him, do you think that's a shift that's going to stay? With the setting the personality and some of the drama aside, but in the more conservative views, an America First agenda, reducing the debt, trying to deal with inflation, et cetera, those are good principles, right? Do you think that's going to stick?
Man, I wish I knew the answer to that, because I would apply my knowledge to the stock market and probably do a lot better. It's difficult to say. Here's what I observed happening during the election. And again, my focus is often the young adults. Young men shifted strongly toward Trump. Young women shifted strongly toward Harris. The issue for men was the economy. The issue for the young women was their fear that somehow their bodies were going to be taken over in a Trump administration. They wouldn't have the freedom to choose. That's how young men and young women see it. But you always watch the independents, because a certain number of people are always going to vote for the Republican candidate. A certain number of people are always going to vote for the Democratic candidate. Where are the independents? And the independents now are conservative and pro-Trump more than I have ever seen, ever. It's something on some of these issues, like you mentioned, immigration, inflation. Trump is now polling something like 77% of independents. So as long as those independents continue to embrace the idea that we need a whole different approach, different philosophy of government, different approach to national security and so forth, then these trends can be enduring. But again, people tend, you got to do it. You got to act. I think a lot of people are right now happy that Trump is doing something because, let's be honest, you can't sustain what we have been doing as a nation. The federal government spends every year $2 trillion more than it takes in every year. And so people now on the left will say, well, Republicans are bad. People on the right say, well, the Democrats are bad. Nobody's really digging into what the core question is, which is, what is the purpose of government? What should the government be doing? Should the government be our conscience? Should the government be the place where value creation takes place in our nation? If so, then it doesn't matter. John Maynard Keynes said it doesn't matter how much debt you have as a government, as long as you can use your debt to reduce unemployment. As long as you have full employment, then essentially you can spend yourselves rich. That was John Maynard Keynes' economic philosophy. Well, it's been a disaster. It's a total disaster. And the impact is going to fall on the rising generation. We're only a few years away, and you can listen to Janet Yellen on this. She's not like a right-wing conservative. She was, in the Biden administration. She says we're only a few years away, maybe 5, possibly 10, from the place where our debt service is going to be more than our federal tax receipts. At that point, it's sort of like, owing more money every year than you bring in, to the point where you're spending all of your entire income paying interest on what you owe.
Yeah.
That's called bankruptcy.
Yep.
And then America completely loses its standing in the world. All of these nations that are currently lining up against America to try to form an alternate currency, they get a lot of purchase out of that. And who knows what happens from there. So we are literally on the brink. Something has to break.
I was talking to an economist who was in the Reagan administration about 3 years ago, and I said, what do we do with this debt? I mean, because the per capita number is mind-numbing. And he literally shrugged his shoulders, Jeff, and said, it doesn't matter. And that, back to your point. Right. And it's as though this, I hate the idiom, kicking the can down the road, but it's this proverbial, it's not my problem, it's too big to fix, and it'll somehow, those things will flourish one day. They will come home to roost. And it'll be very interesting, back to your comment about, the economic stand in the world. It's kind of chilling in one hand, as a believer in Christ, I worry my confidence in Christ certainly transcends the economy. But I do wonder, like all of us do, kids and grandkids, what would happen if we had not a depression, but a bankruptcy, to use your term, that would, if they could dig out of it, would take decades to rebuild an economy.
Yeah. Well, there are two things that have to happen. First, you need more federal tax receipts. That's only going to come from dramatic economic growth. Second of all, you need what the Europeans call austerity, which is you just freeze all of the government funding and try to cut it wherever you can.
Good luck.
Yeah, right. So the debt seems huge if economic growth is slow. If economic growth is really fast, then it pales a little bit. Mm-hmm. But still, think about it in your personal life. Let's say a person makes $100,000 a year and they have to spend right now $30,000 a year paying interest on their credit cards. Okay, well, that means they're not going to use $30,000 to start a business. They're not going to use $30,000 to provide donations or some other value in the economy. If you can cut that $30,000 down to zero, then all of a sudden the money that you were just essentially throwing away, now you retrieve for some greater purpose. That has to happen as well. But that's the balance. It actually is just like a huge person. Just think about what your personal finances are like. That's what the federal government needs to be thinking about. And I think what Trump has done is establish the reality that we can't go on this way. We simply can't. If the entire government has to completely shut down to fix the problem, then it has to shut down. This has never happened before. Not even Ronald Reagan was able to move the country to that level of realization.
Well, having lived in Northern Virginia for many years, we worked and lived and associated with those who worked for the federal government and the bureaucracies. And there are a lot of folks and a lot of buildings and a lot of overhead. And it'll be interesting to see what DOGE they continue to expose, but can they legislate? Is my question.
Right.
You can expose all this stuff and blow the whistle, but until it's legislated, an executive order only lasts a couple of years, maybe.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about where your hope is, especially when you're thinking of your audience that you're, I would say, ministering to, you're equipping, you're challenging, you're helping them. To me, the education mantle has been broken so far. We don't teach critical thinking anymore. We're into subjects, we're into, emphases, but we're not teaching critical thinking. And that may be an oversimplification, but I'll let you comment on that.
When I think of the term critical thinking, I'm thinking of how to logically organize your thoughts, and specifically in terms of citizenship. So how do you make a case? Well, what people do today is make a case against other people. That's in logical terms called ad hominem. It's a logical fallacy. It's to the man. What I'm trying to teach students to do is go back and ask some bigger questions. What is the family for? What is government for? What is the church for? And I think we talked about this when we were together 6 months ago a little bit, but it's probably worth re-emphasizing. Part of critical thinking is organizing your thinking according to what is actually so. You can't have a culture where 75% of people say there are no absolute truths and expect anybody to think critically. Because if there's no truth, then there is no basis on which to make observations about the world that are knowably true. So I think we have to go back and reclaim that. And that's why, what we're doing at Summit Ministries right now feels to me like, wow, this is really mission critical for these students. Can we know there is such a thing as truth? We actually make the case that you can. We actually make the case that God has designed government on purpose, but he designed the family on purpose and the church. And if we see all three of these things properly relating to one another, properly balanced in their proper spheres, then you can see a flourishing society. But, I'd be happy to dig into that a little bit more, because I think there's something that a lot of people miss, even about what economic growth is. They don't see themselves personally as part of that discussion.
Well, and back to your point about the $100,000 illustration, had you talked more, I'm sure you would have commented saving. Growing up as a Depression era child, my dad being a Depression era, and we grew up in that household. The first thing you did was save, not spend. And that was hardwired into all three of the Easley kids. We were taught never had a credit card. My dad never purchased anything on debt. And I wouldn't even say it wasn't an argument. It's just the way it was. And now I remember when I was in elementary school, deficit spending was introduced. And even in my pea brain, I went, how can you spend money you don't have? So from an economic mindset, whether it's just look at college loans, for example, the generation you're trying to appeal to and encourage and equip, this is foreign territory, Jeff.
One of the reasons it's foreign, Michael, is that all of the spending people do today isn't with actual physical paper money. So when I have a young person, they want to go out and get a coffee or something, they just use their Apple Pay. They never actually see a bill.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And you tend to overspend. If you had the actual physical money in your pocket and you saw how fast it was going out, you might have a different approach to it. But that's part of, some people think, that's why we're growing economically, because people are overspending.
Yeah.
That's not true. Your father's instinct was correct, because savings is a form of investing. You're investing long-term in the future. You could invest by putting your money into an account where that money gets turned around and is used to build infrastructure projects that produce a profit. You could start your own business. I'm telling my students these days, every one of you, 100% of you need to start a business. Doesn't have to be a big business. Could just be dog walking, but something where the actual money comes in and then you watch how the actual money goes out. You become responsible for the level of taxation. You produce economic growth. That's value creation. Everybody should be involved in that. The number one thing starting a business teaches you is that you have to serve in order to succeed. The government doesn't have to serve you. The government bureaucracy, right now, people in the bureaucracy are saying, we don't even have to do what the president says. Are you kidding me? They don't have a servant mindset. They have a mindset of we are the ones in charge, not the president. We're the ones in charge, and we will tell you what to do. Try that in a business. Try that in a restaurant business.
And that's obviously one of the most, egregious parts of so much of our political structure is these men and women have never made a payroll. They've never paid taxes on a company. My wife's a realtor, and the amount of money she pays in quarterly is sinful. It's sinful right. How much she has to give back to the government. And they did nothing for her. She did all the work. And that's she right. pays all her dues and all her license and all her credentials and her own vehicle and all her expenses. And then she has to give the government almost half of what she makes. And it's like, are you kidding me? But again, if you got a job somewhere and work for someone, you don't understand this. And anyway, I digress. Where's your hope when you look at these young men and women and when you look at the country? And maybe, I'm with you, it's a tentativeness, but it seems... And just my opinion, my worldview, it seems like there's a little lift in the culture, a little lift in the church, that they don't feel like they're under the microscope. They're going to be as attacked as readily, perhaps. Where's your hope?
Yeah, well, my hope for the rising generation is mostly spiritual. I'm watching young adults who've bottomed out with the postmodern and post-truth cultural idea. They've become unhappy. American young people are so unhappy. American young people rank 62nd in the nations of the world in happiness. And when you look at the growing level of unhappiness, American young people, Michael, are right there. I think it's 132nd of the nations of the world.
Wow.
In the amount of growing unhappiness. By the way, that's right down there with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Which is one of the scariest places
sorry to laugh.
in the world. I don't know. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it is one of the scariest places in the world. It is. There are more than 50 different armies fighting for control of the nation, poverty, disease, and American young people are right down there. Well, Israeli young people are number 2 in happiness in the whole world among young people. Israeli young people. They're a tiny country surrounded by fighting wars on 7 different fronts. All Israeli young people are required to engage in military service.
Idea.
Yet they are the second happiest group of people in the world. The first happiest group is Luxembourg, by the way. I don't know anything about Luxembourg, so I don't know what makes them so happy, but I think I'll go over and try to find out.
I don't want to speculate.
Yeah, why would Israeli young people be so happy? I think all American young people know the answer. They have resilience. They have a cause that's worth fighting for, that makes it more worth fighting side by side than fighting each other. So I'm starting to see that happen in the rising generation. As I mentioned, especially among young men. The reason I think that's such a hopeful trend is all of my life, this is the 3rd generation of young adults I've worked with. I started with my peers, Gen X, then millennials, then Gen Z. When men are godly, society has a big view of God. When men are not godly, society has a small view of God. If you see men inching toward godliness, then there's a tremendous sense of momentum that brings to every aspect of society.
Yeah, it's out of context, but it brings back the be the man, play the man. Was it Cromwell? Play the man. I often tell people be strong and have good courage. That's what men were designed to do, and yet we've talked about it. But the vilification of the young men, I'm glad to hear you say that. Let me ask you just to follow up on the hope. Where's your take on the church today in America?
Man, I have a hard time defining church anymore. I speak in a lot of churches. I love doing it. I love the people I get to meet, the pastors. Everybody's working so hard. These Kidman people, they're unbelievable. They're just amazing people. And yet, most of the people who are attending, it's sort of like going to the movies. You're going for a show, and then you get your coffee, and then you leave. They see themselves as going to church rather than being the church. And I'm looking around for church traditions that are stronger in that respect. I think small groups or life groups have helped us a tremendous amount. But I was recently at a church. I spoke. They held a big conference of grandparents conference. They had, across the country, 9,000 some grandparents. It was hysterical. They're hilarious. It was so much fun. But this church, it's in the South. They expect involvement. If you're attending the church, they're asking you, what ministry are you going to be a part of? They expect that the church will be the center of ministry. There's no part of their community that's not touched. If you go to the homeless shelter, they're there. If you go to the public schools, they're there ministering to the teachers. And that kind of thing gives me a tremendous amount of hope. But remember, the church is the conscience of society. So what we've got to grapple with as Christians is we've allowed, through our negligence, the government to take over the responsibility of being the conscience of a society. Conscience means what we know together. Well, if what we know together is the responsibility of the government, then conscience becomes rooted in law rather than in choice. That's why you see in Germany, their federal government going in and arresting people for having posted a meme on the internet, because the government is the conscience of the society, and the government only has one thing it can do. Okay, a lot of people think, the government can give benefits. No, it can't. There's only one power the government has, and that's the power to punish. It has the power to punish legally. So it can only give to one person by punishing someone else. We always have to keep that in mind. Well, now we're backing away from the idea that the government's going to be the conscience of society. There's a vacuum. Do we just turn back to radical individualism? I'm my own person and I decide everything for myself, kind of an anarchy? Or does the church step in and say, we can help guide you toward a good life, a life where you become a blessing and help others flourish, a life where all together as a people we become strong? That's our opportunity.
Dr. Jeff Meyer, information about him and Summit Ministries in our show notes. Check out any one of his almost 20 books. The book on Israel is extraordinarily helpful. Jeff, thanks again so much for coming on the broadcast. We greatly appreciate your time and the ministry that you're doing. Just an amazing job. It's fun to watch you from the cheap sheets, brother.
Well, thanks. And thanks for your encouragement of the rising generation and for tackling tough topics. I really, really appreciate that about you. And I've followed your work actually for a very long time. I didn't tell you this when we were on the show last, but I think when you were president of Moody Bible Institute, and I wrote you a little note because you had written a book that I thought was great, and I wrote you a little note, and you wrote me back. And I thought, I really like this guy. He actually is, he's personal. He doesn't just take these relationships for granted, even though he's in leadership. So actually from afar, that taught me a little bit more about leadership. So thank you.
Kind of you, brother. God bless until the next time, I hope.
Take care, Michael.